It might, and I stress that this is just me speculating, it might possibly be on that Monday the 19th, but we really do need to wait for official acknowledgement or information from Buckingham Palace. And there
yes. Is the plane carrying King Charles, arriving, making very quick time, arriving into RAF Northolt, which is West London. It's about 13 or 14 miles away from the centre of London, Buckingham Palace, which is where the King and the Queen Consort, Queen Camilla, will be heading. They only left less than an hour ago from Aberdeen, and quite a moment for King Charles as he returns to London.
It is, yeah. This is a private charter flight which went up to Aberdeen to collect him. It's not the same aircraft that took the other members of the royal family up. That was an RAF aircraft. This, as I say, a private charter flight. Now coming into RAF Northolt, and then there will be the journey that, of course, we saw the new Prime Minister making just a couple of days ago, in her case to Downing Street, but the Metropolitan Police will be whisking the new King and the Queen Consort and their immediate officials not to Clarence House, which of course would be where they would normally return to when they come to London, but that in itself is a sign of the considerable, profound change that has occurred. He will be going to Buckingham Palace, and we would expect that quite possibly they will look at the floral tributes that are there and look at some of the cards that are being left and perhaps meet some of the mourners who are there. But there is other business, other important business for the King to be doing. He will be meeting with the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, this afternoon. That first formal conversation between the new King and the new Prime Minister. And he will be preparing for the broadcast, the King's address, which we expect will be going out at around 6 o'clock tonight. Again, I stress that all of these timings are subject to confirmation and clarification. And there will be many things that he will be wanting to consider, many plans. Although they're already drawn up, they will just need to be finally looked at, and he will want to ensure that when he visits the four nations, and over the next few days he can be expected to be visiting Cardiff and Edinburgh and Northern Ireland, and he will be, I'm sure, making speeches in each of those capital cities. And again, these initial speeches will be very important, setting the tone for his reign.
And it does feel like a real moment of change now. We've briefly glimpsed the King as he boarded the plane, but there the royal car is lined up on the tarmac waiting to take him, the royal standard flying above it. A real moment of change, a very familiar figure, Prince Charles as we have always known him, now King Charles III with Queen Camilla.
And there is the inevitable comparison, Sophie, with the scenes that we are all familiar with from the newsreels of the return to this country of Queen Elizabeth, who left this country as Princess Elizabeth in February 1952, was seen off by her father, George VI, who was seriously ill, though nobody quite realised how ill he was. And she, of course, had to cut short that tour of Africa, and she was planning to go on to the Far East, had to cut that short and return to London, being flown by BOAC, landing at a very early Heathrow airport and being met on the tarmac by the royal limousines. And here we are about to see a modern-day equivalent of that scenario unfolding. This jet aircraft which has brought the King and the Queen Consort from Aberdeen to London, to RAF Northolt, not, as we understand it, not to be met by any cabinet ministers, but to be met by the vehicles which are drawn up. And I think I noticed that it is the Queen's vehicle. It's the sovereign's, the monarch's vehicle, the large vehicle that it is. And that is the vehicle that in a few moments will take the King and the Queen Consort, to Buckingham Palace. And a sense really that this reign then is beginning, because yesterday was a day for family mourning when the family was all together up there at Balmoral Castle with their own thoughts, but now a return to the capital and the beginning of the formal work as king, meeting the Prime Minister, preparing to address the nation, preparing for the days of mourning, preparing for the task that falls on his shoulders to be that figure of reassurance and stability.
And as that door opens, it all becomes very public, doesn't it? For the new king, he's had hours of private grief, and now it turns to a very public duty. He will be seen right around the country in the next few days, right around the world. These images will be beamed everywhere.
Yes, you're right. He's stepping out of the private opportunity to grieve now onto the public stage that he will occupy for the next, well, who knows how many years as king. But this really is the moment when the work as monarch begins. That one of the older vehicles from the royal fleet, but flying the royal standard, the monarch's sovereign, flying on that vehicle, the standard of King Charles III. Just shaking hands with some of the flight crew. Oh no, I beg your pardon, that's obviously an RAF officer.
And now the Queen Consort, Queen Camilla, also descending the stairs there. A small greeting party.
Yes, it is a very small greeting party. There, Clive Alderton, or Sir Clive Alderton, his principal private secretary, the tall figure just behind Camilla, and some of his other officials who've been up at Burke Hall on the Balmoral estate with him, Simon Enright, his communications secretary, and others. And they clearly will have a lot of these arrangements already worked out, because that's what they do. That's what the officials are there for, to make sure that there is a plan for every eventuality, to ensure that all the contingencies are taken care of. And I can see, there we are, Arthur Edwards.
Arthur Edwards from the Sun newspaper, absolutely, who has followed the royal family for so many decades now, hasn't he? And there at another crucial moment of history.
And I know how important it will be to him, to Arthur. He's followed Prince Charles, and who's extremely fond of Prince Charles, and how important it will have been for him to have been there to capture those images of the King returning to London. But so they all seem to be seated in the vehicles, and very shortly they will, I'm sure, be departing from RAF Northolt for the journey into London.
And just on the subject of the Queen Consort and her official titles now, the King and Queen, the King and Queen Consort?
I think it is the King and Queen. I think there is perhaps a need just to draw the distinction that she is not Queen Regina. I mean, we are used to referring to the Queen. Camilla is not the Queen in the sense that Queen Elizabeth was Queen Sovereign. She is Queen Consort, and there is a very important constitutional distinction, obviously. There can only be one sovereign, and that sovereign is the King. But through 1,000 years of custom and practice, the wife of the King has always been known as the Queen. Now, there was some sensitivity, obviously, over that, because of all the history, the domestic history of Camilla and everything, which is why initially it had been suggested that she would be known as Princess Consort. But the Queen, made it very clear in that message that she issued at the time of the 70th anniversary of her accession back in February, that she wished it to be the case that she should be known. Her wish, her sincere wish, was that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. And that was a declaration that nobody really could gainsay. The Queen said it, therefore it had to be. And of course Charles would have been delighted that that removed what could have been one of the tricky, sensitive issues at this moment of his accession. What do we call Camilla?
And so they leave RAF Northolt, about a half-hour journey into central London from the airfield in West London, 14 miles or so, and they will head straight to Buckingham Palace, where the King will be able to see the crowds, see the messages, see the flowers that have been laid out, and no doubt the crowds will be growing as his arrival is imminent.
Yes, as we understand it, he will go directly to Buckingham Palace. It would be curious if he didn't, because it's another symbolic moment of the king returning to the capital city and to his palace, to the headquarters of the British monarchy, which of course it remains. It's known that he's never been terribly keen to base himself at Buckingham Palace, but I suspect that he will just have to reconcile himself to that and move himself from Clarence House in just the same way as the Queen and Prince Philip, rather against their wishes. They'd made themselves very comfortable at Clarence House. That was their home back in 1952. And of course the Queen Mother was in residence at Buckingham Palace, but the then Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, made it clear that the monarch resides at Buckingham Palace. So I would imagine that the same thing will happen this time, and that in due course Charles and Camilla, the King and the Queen Consort, will move themselves from Clarence House, which has been their very comfortable home for a number of years, into the big house, as it were, into Buckingham Palace. Though clearly he also, I'm sure, will spend a lot of time at Windsor. He likes Windsor, and of course he has Highgrove, his country home in Gloucestershire. But all of these things will have to be worked out, together with, as he steps up and is now king, William will become the heir to the throne, the direct heir to the throne, and we would expect that he would be named as Prince of Wales. So William and Catherine, they will continue to be the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, but they will get a sort of up-ranked to Prince and Princess of Wales. That's what we would expect, because, again, by many centuries of custom, the heir to the throne is known as the Prince of Wales. But that, again, is a decision for the king, and that is one of those decisions that will be made known in the days to come.
And we will hear from the new king publicly. He will address the nation, we think, at about 6 o'clock this evening. And no doubt reflect on his mother, who he was incredibly close to, wasn't he? It was very obvious in appearances, when he was with her, when he wasn't with her, but the way he spoke about her, just how intimate, how close that bond between mother and son was.
They had certainly become much, much closer in recent years. I think there were difficult periods in the relationship whilst his first marriage was disintegrating. And I think that there were strains then. But look at these pictures. Look at a number of people lining the streets. Not huge crowds, but significant numbers who have come out to wave and to greet the king back to London.
And it's so familiar just from a few days ago when we watched the new Prime Minister make exactly the same journey. The traffic halted, the cars making their way through West London. It is extraordinary to think the events that have happened over the last week.
Yeah. It really is. It really
is.
Yes. I don't suppose it can ever have happened before that both the head of state and the head of government have changed within the space not just of a week, but 72 hours. That is extraordinary, quite extraordinary. So convoy, the motorcade, makes its way at a rather more stately pace, I would say, than the Prime Minister's motorcade, but the Metropolitan Police Special Escort motorcyclists zooming around and clearing the road ahead. So I would imagine, yes, that it would be a good 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour. Well, we shall see. The road conditions are pretty good.
When the King addresses the nation tonight, and over the next few days, the next few weeks, we will get a sense, far more of a sense of Charles as king and the kind of king that he is going to be.
And I think he will indicate that he will be the kind of monarch to which we have become accustomed over the past 70 years. He has made it clear that he fully understands and appreciates the discipline, the constraints, the circumspection that is absolutely required of the monarch within a constitutional monarchy. At the same time, I think it would be odd if some of his personality didn't reflect itself in the way that he conducts himself as monarch. The Queen was perhaps a rather understated monarch, very shrewd, very engaged, absorbed an awful lot of information, had a great interest in the role as monarch, but kept her counsel very much to herself. I suspect that there may be thought to be just some, and I stress some, latitude for a slightly more proactive monarch. We've talked before of this word, this convening ability of a monarch. And I can't imagine, it is inconceivable that Charles will be able to just forget his passionate interest in the environment in particular. And it has been suggested that one might see the Buckingham Palace Conference on the rainforests under the convening chairmanship of the King. Now that's a very powerful invitation if you receive that. Who's not going to attend such a discussion at Buckingham Palace? But he's shrewd enough and he's seen enough of it over the 73 years of his life and the many years when he's been actively engaged as Prince of Wales to know where the boundary line is. And he did make that comment in that BBC documentary on his 70th birthday when he was directly asked, are you going to be a meddling monarch? Which has often been the fear expressed by some politicians even. And he made it clear, no, he said, I'm not stupid. I do realise that this is a different job with different requirements. And you can, I think, assume that he has reconciled himself in his mind to the different requirements of this role that we see him speeding towards now.
Indeed, making quick progress towards the centre of London now. The crowd's still very large outside Buckingham Palace, the flowers being laid, still people continue to arrive there to pay tribute, the flag at half-mast. And the new king there making very rapid progress towards the centre of the city. And as far as the other members of the royal family, who all we know rushed to Balmoral to be by the Queen's bedside, Prince William is on his way back, we think, at the moment. Prince Harry has returned, and the other Queen's children are likely to return very shortly as well.
Yes, the Princess Royal was already in Scotland, and I think we know of her love for Scotland, staying at Balmoral. Yeah, I mean, clearly they will return. I don't know, Sophie, what the arrangements are for the others. We know, as you say, that Harry left, it sounds, quite early this morning, and it sounds as though he's made his own separate arrangements for travel back to London. And as Sarah Campbell was saying a few moments ago, William left a short time ago and is returning to London, possibly even by a commercial flight. I don't know. But so the Duke of York, well, we don't know what the arrangements are for him, and we probably won't be told, since, as we know, he's not a working member of the royal family. And the Wessexes, they, and in particular Sophie, the Countess of Wessex, of course, very, very close to the Queen. Not one of her children, daughter-in-law. But there was a real bond between the Queen and Sophie Wessex. She fitted very completely and successfully into the family. And I think the first, one of the many clues that we had yesterday afternoon was when we were sitting here seeing the photographs of those family members arriving at Balmoral. And I must say, I thought the look on Sophie's face really indicated that, yeah, it indicated what was happening and what their feelings were. So yeah, we assume that she and her husband, the Earl of Wessex, are still at Balmoral.
And so different. You spoke earlier about the moment that Elizabeth, then Princess Elizabeth, she went to Kenya, she came back as Queen, and she was so young. There was the shock of the moment. Her father died very suddenly. Charles, King Charles, 73 years old, he has known this moment is coming for a very long time. But there is still that palpable sense of shock in the nation, isn't there? People almost holding their breaths yesterday, and a real sense of disbelief, in a sense, that the Queen has actually gone. Boris Johnson talking about how you felt that she was eternal, that she would live on.
It still feels quite unreal, doesn't it, really? This is a moment, of course, that we've thought about, that Charles has thought about, and now it has happened. Now it is reality. The Queen has passed away, the reign is over, and a new reign immediately is beginning. And we will see and hear this afternoon and in coming days the essential sort of building blocks of that reign. Charles will set out. He won't, I'm sure, set out how he intends to reign, because we must assume, and I'm sure he will reign in the same style, the same fundamental style, because that is what the Constitution requires of the monarch, not to be involved in politics and all the rest of it. But he must lead the nation. He must now adopt that head of the nation role at this time when, as we were saying yesterday, many people will feel unsettled and disorientated, and they will be feeling that personal loss. I was struck by one of the notes that had been left at Balmoral, as Sarah Campbell was telling us, a calming figure throughout my life. Somebody wrote on a card at Balmoral, a calming figure. Well, that calming figure has gone. So she needs to be replaced by a figure who can demonstrate that he too is capable of calming and reassuring and being the focus for unity that is so essential, which is such a fundamental part of what the monarchy does, to be that focus for reassurance and unity and stability.
Which was very much evident during the pandemic, when people were very much adrift, didn't know what was happening, strange times, nothing was normal. And the Queen addressed the nation and said, "We will meet again." And it was that sense of calm that she instilled.
And it's to do and say things that politicians can't. It's to bring that resonance that is beyond, not the ability, but what's the right word, that is beyond the remit, beyond the force, the power almost of politicians. That if you have the monarch saying and doing things, there is a greater force, there is a greater resonance. Because they speak so rarely, it's unusual. It has a power that doesn't attach to statements by politicians who we hear all the time. And I think this whole episode will perhaps underline the strengths of a monarchy. It's only when you lose something that you really appreciate its value. Well, we haven't lost the monarchy, but we have lost the previous monarch. And I suppose for 70 years, the monarchy has been so closely identified with Elizabeth that it is going to take a little bit of adjustment to understand that the crown has passed and it is the system. It's not so much the individual, it's the institution that matters here. And it is the institution of which Charles is now becoming the personification. And it is that institution, the crown, to which all the most powerful organs of the state owe their allegiance. And that, again, is one of the strengths of having a constitutional monarchy, the crown, this figure above politics, to whom the army, the courts, the judiciary, the civil service, the government, the police, owe their ultimate allegiance. And it's important, I think, to separate the two, the institution from the individual. We have a new individual now taking over as the embodiment of the crown. For 70 years, the strengths of the institution have been matched by the strengths of the individual. We have a new individual there who's got to demonstrate that he also has the strengths of character, the ability to reassure, the ability to do all of those things that we took it for granted that the Queen was able to do, and did time and again.
Although we know, strangely, we know him so much better than we ever knew the Queen when she became Queen. Prince Charles, as he was then, has made. We've heard him speak. He's been very public for so many decades now.
Well, indeed, but perhaps that is part of the problem, the challenge that he faces. We almost have seen too much of him. We've encountered his interventions on a number of different subjects, and it is that, of course, that has given rise to some of the questions about his ability to transition to the role as monarch. We've followed his life, his domestic life, and there are difficulties there, and there are some people still who have reservations about the Queen Consort and everything. But this isn't the moment to dwell on that. But no, he's not an unknown quantity by any means, but he is unknown in this new role that, as of yesterday afternoon, he's now taken on. And that is a role that he has had so long to think about, so long, decades after decade. But he's been punctilious in never saying anything. He's never publicly anticipated this moment. He regarded it as being most indiscreet and disrespectful to his mother ever to say anything about the moment when he became king, and you can understand that. The only reference he has made was that reference in that documentary where he made it clear that he wouldn't intervene in the same way, that he did understand that it was a different role. But we have no other information, no other facts, no other anything on the record from him talking about how he intends to reign as king.
And what about the impact on other senior members of the royal family? Prince William, for example, you've mentioned already a change of title. Prince William now is also the Duke of Cornwall, am I right?
No, that's...
They will take on different titles, so the titles moved.
Well, Charles was Duke of Cornwall. He's Duke of Cambridge, of course, and he will remain Duke of Cambridge, and he is still the Duke of Cambridge, or it's really much simpler just to call him Prince William. But I would imagine that, yes, because, as we were saying a moment ago, it is custom and practice for the heir to the throne. He's now the first in line to the throne. So it is a more senior role for him. But he and his father have been drawn together, I think, by some of the difficulties that have been caused by William's brother and by Prince Andrew. And I think there are not now three, either present or future, monarchs able to consult with each other, but that was happening an awful lot, particularly discussing the family issues, the Queen, Charles and William. Well, it's now Charles and William. Now, that relationship hasn't always been difficult, and what relationship between a father and a son is always smooth. But I think William has come to appreciate his father much, much more in recent years, and I think perhaps William has come to understand some of the pressures that Charles has faced at different points in his life. And William, as we know, is very determined to ensure that his eldest son, George, is not exposed to the sort of difficulties that perhaps William, felt that he was exposed to earlier in his life, with a father who was just very busy, very devoted to his work as Prince of Wales. What implications for other members of the royal family? Well, no implications for the Sussexes, because they're not, as it were, working members of the royal family. The Princess Royal, well, I'm sure, there's a close relationship between Charles and his younger sister, and I'm sure that he will need his sister and his younger brother Edward to be closely around him. Although they won't be part of the central nucleus of the royal family, that clearly will be Charles and then William and his family. How the size of that family has been transformed in recent times. It has always been said that one of Charles's ambitions would be to have a slimmed-down royal family, because that would be more in keeping with the times, and I think many people would perhaps agree with that. Well, he won't need to do anything, because that slimming down has just happened automatically, by default, as it were.
Well, there is the car carrying the new king and the Queen Consort, Queen Camilla. They are now, I recognise that part of West London, Shepherd's Bush. They're on the Westway, heading in, not that far away, probably about 10 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes away from Buckingham Palace. I don't know if we can show you any images from the palace and what awaits them. The crowds, there are big crowds out there at the moment. The barriers have been put up, flowers have been laid at the gates, but clearly an expectation that when the King and Queen Consort arrive at the palace, they may well get out of their cars, and rather than go straight into the palace, will come out and greet the public, greet the people who have been there in such great numbers for so many hours now, paying tribute to the Queen.
And just as the arrival of his flight from Aberdeen at Northolt reminded us of the Queen's return to this country in 1952, so the King's return to Buckingham Palace, I suspect, will remind us, it's on a smaller scale, but will remind us of the Queen's return to Buckingham Palace after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. A tense moment for the monarchy. We remember those shots of the car coming down Constitution Hill and then stopping outside Buckingham Palace. as she got out to inspect the flowers and meet some of the mourners there. Well, perhaps that will happen again. We don't know, and they're very near Paddington Station now.
Absolutely, not very far away now. So they'll be heading into towards Hyde Park and then Green Park and to the Palace. So really not very far away at all now. And you do wonder what must be going through the King's mind. He will have written his words. He will know what he is going to say to the nation tonight. And it will be a real balance, won't it, of the public, the duty, the continuity, but also of the private and his reflections on his mother, a woman that was held so dearly by so many people.
However much time he has spent, and it must be considerable time that he has spent over the years thinking about this moment, it must equally, I would have thought, be pretty daunting for him at the moment, sitting in the back of the sovereign's vehicle, not the first time he's used it, obviously, but realising that he is now approaching Buckingham Palace, that he will step out of that car. He is the king, he is now the head of state, he is now the sovereign. Yes, all these plans have been worked through in great detail for several years, the whole plan for his accession. Of course it has, it wouldn't be sensible for it to be otherwise. But however careful the planning has been, there will always be considerations to take into account when the moment comes. So, yeah, it is a challenging moment for him. I think that is undeniable. But he will have his speech. He will, I'm sure, be working on it with Clive Alderton and some of his other senior officials. He will know what he wants to say. He will, I'm sure, want to pay tribute, of course, to his mother. What else will he say? Well, he will, I'm sure, just indicate in some way how he intends to pick up the baton, carry the torch forward in the way that the country... He needs to say what the country wants to hear, doesn't he, really? He needs to find a way of forming words and thoughts that are reassuring and that are calming.
Particularly at a time, the Queen, as we were saying, such continuity, somebody who has been there for virtually all of us throughout our entire lives. And right now, at a state of such flux in our nation, continuity, stability is what he will need to focus on.
Yes, and it is a more challenging circumstance to inherit the throne than perhaps he might have imagined, with the scale of the various political and economic and so on, and war in Europe and all these other challenges that we and other nations face. But that is, although he's clearly, as constitutional monarch, he's not involved in the politics of any of this, he needs to be that figure, that credible figure above politics, that the nation can feel comfortable with. And also in his mind, of course, will be the fact, the awareness that there are anti-monarchist groups who have been biding their time, who've been waiting for precisely this moment in the hope that they will be able to further their cause at the moment when the Queen is no longer on the throne and that throne has passed to Charles. And there will be those groups here in the United Kingdom, and there will, of course, also be those groups in some of this rather quaint expression, the realms, in Australia and New Zealand and Canada and in the Caribbean. And it was noticeable, I thought, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in Rwanda in June, in the address that the Prince of Wales made, as he was then, on behalf of his mother. And there was a very significant passage in that address where he said, look, if any of you nations feel that you do no longer wish to be part of the monarchy, to no longer wish to have us as your heads of state, we perfectly understand. That is a decision for you. We're all mature and grown up about this. Please just take the decision, and if that is your wish and your will, then off you go. We will still remain friends. And there must be a concern within Buckingham Palace that there will now be countries which will more seriously contemplate becoming republics and dropping the monarchy. And there is always that danger of a sort of domino effect happening. And that is something that perhaps he may wish to, perhaps not today, but speak about again in coming weeks.
And there are the cars driving past Marble Arch. Now they're on Park Lane, a very short journey now between where they are to the palace. They have to get to Hyde Park Corner. and then just straight down to the palace, where they'll sweep in through those gates, and it will be fascinating to see the reception that he gets. Huge sympathy, no doubt, from the crowds that are waiting outside, because whatever else, this is a man who has lost his mother.
Yes, they will shortly be heading down Constitution Hill, and absolutely right, Sophie. I mean, I think the people who have gathered at Buckingham Palace have gone there because they have been moved by these events, and in a moment or two they will see the new king, the man who has, as you say, lost his mother, and who is now a focus for the nation's mourning, and I'm sure it will be a very supportive and sympathetic crowd. Flag at half-mast there on, I think that's one of the big hotels on Park Lane. And just, it looks as though they're just going past the Dorchester Hotel there, I think.
Absolutely.
So, a very short distance now to run.
And we should learn soon, presumably, when the Queen's funeral will be held. It's normally about 10 or 11 days after the monarch's death.
Yeah, I think within Buckingham Palace they will be putting together all the pieces of the jigsaw, revising this London Bridge plan, and all these things have, of course, been planned out for years in advance. They had to be refined quite substantially during COVID in case anything had to take place then. But no, those plans will be published and shared with us over the next few days, because clearly people need to know and want to know. People will want to know when the lying in state is taking place now, just going around Hyde Park Corner, I think, aren't they?
Number 1 London there, and this is right next to Admiralty Arch, isn't it? And yes, they're very, very close now. The walls of Buckingham Palace will come into vision very shortly, and there we go. That is Hyde Park Corner. And the convoy of cars, the crowds who've been waiting out there for a very long time now, will catch sight of them shortly. You must wonder what the people here, who probably don't expect to see the new king quite so quickly, but there they are. They're maybe just crossing the road, and the convoy sweeping past them, the whole of the area there at Constitution Hill, which has been shut off to traffic.
Quite a number of people there. A lot of tourists, I'm sure, but also a lot of, I'm sure, people of this nation who are there, people waving to the car as it goes past. A lot of police there, I noticed. And yes, the trees still very much in leaf in this early September, and in a moment we should get a sight of them as they emerge.
And there you go, you can see the crowds have gathered there, and I've been waiting for a long time. People with their arms aloft, camera phones ready to capture this moment of history, to capture the moment that the new king arrives at Buckingham Palace.
Yes, I'm just looking at the aerial shot, and you can see there really are quite significant numbers there.
The outriders were police who've been escorting the king and queen. And a huge cheer as he arrives. A huge shout of "God save the King." And so King Charles straight to the public to greet the people who have been waiting for so long, to exchange a few words with them as he arrives here at Buckingham Palace. King Charles III.
Interesting people of all ages, aren't they? Just looking at the faces and trying to just identify. There are a lot of British voices there, aren't there? I mean, normally at this time of the year, perhaps most of the people outside Buckingham Palace would still be tourists, but some flowers, yes.
So many people there gathered, wanting to just shake his hand. You can see the real sympathy with him as they stand there, the appreciation too, that he's come out here to greet people who have been waiting for so long.
Yes. And I'm sure he will be touched and encouraged by the reception that he's receiving. All right, these are people who are perhaps committed and very much supportive of the monarchy. But you can see some faces which are clearly emotional. And as I was saying, there are people of every age and from all parts of society, and very supportive.
And all these shouts of God save the King, something anyone under the age of 70, or in their 70s will not have heard before.
About my age, yes.
But it's the real moment,
Yeah,
isn't it? It's the moment
it
of
is.
change,
It
hearing
is.
that.
Yes, it is. And this is what we must now adjust to. This is now the reality of our United Kingdom, which now has as its head of state a king. We haven't known that, as you say, for more than 70 years. And it does take a little bit of getting used to, doesn't it? To have to say, the king, God save the king, yes, those shouts that we can hear.
So many hands outstretched, so many people wanting to greet King Charles. He hasn't even stepped into Buckingham Palace yet.
No, and it's quite a long line. Again, I'm just looking at the aerial, and so I suspect, well, we'll just have to wait and see. He may just go in, walk in there
There's
through
aerial
the...
views. Look at the crowds that have gathered. Everyone with their arms aloft, everyone trying to capture that image on their phones. And the flowers there, you can see lined up by the railings.
And that, I suspect, is just a fraction of the number that we will see there by the time the state funeral does take place. I don't know for how long the palace authorities will leave flowers there, but I suspect they may feel that they do need to leave them in place.
It does give you an idea of the crowds, the size of the crowds who will no doubt turn out across London in 10 or so days' time.
Yep, yeah, I think it will.
Funeral.
I think it will surpass. Well, who's to say that it will surpass the crowds that we saw for Diana's funeral or the Queen Mother's funeral? But it will be on a very, very big scale, a very large scale. I think we can say that without any doubt.
And the King has a busy few hours, let alone days ahead of him. He will meet the Prime Minister this afternoon as King. He will make this address to the nation at about 6 o'clock. There's a service at St. Paul's. And then tomorrow the Accession Council, which is the moment when he is proclaimed King. It's not by law, but it is a tradition, a centuries-old tradition that goes back very many centuries, the moment that the nation is told there has
Yes,
been a passing.
all these traditional historical components coming together. As you say, the Accession Council, when normally the entire Privy Council comes together, but the Privy Council is now so large that I think there isn't room for them. So I think they've had to, if not ballot for it, they've restricted it to, is it 500 or 200?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's some Privy Councillors who aren't best pleased at the thought that they won't be there for the Accession Council, which will be a really historic moment, the Accession Council for a new monarch, where there will be an oath will be sworn, and generally the new monarch will say something. And as you say, that will all be televised live.
And that will take place not at Buckingham Palace. Oh, a kiss for the new king. That all takes place not at Buckingham Palace, but at St James's Palace next door. The traditional seat, really, wasn't it? The home of the monarchy.
Absolutely, yep. A much older building than Buckingham Palace, St James's Palace, which of course used to be where Charles was based until the Queen Mother's death, when he then moved across to Clarence House. But yes, and I think he will be. He really is going right down the line, isn't he?
Absolutely.
He doesn't want to disappoint anybody. And so many faces just sort of creased rather with sadness. A lot of tears will have been shed over the past 24 hours, won't they, in many households at the news. But this is the transition that we are witnessing, the different parts of it taking place. The King returning to Buckingham Palace, shaking hands with those people who have gathered there, people who are wishing God save the King and singing God save the King. Somebody from
Somebody
the
trying
media.
to do an interview. I'm not
Yes.
sure that will be taking place right now.
Well, the large protection officer wasn't going to have any of that.
Lots of smiles, lots of sympathy, and people just wanting to shake his hand, really.
Yes, and the sun is shining for him after the storms of yesterday. The weather has cleared over London. It's not a great day, but at least it's a dry day. So I suspect we're very nearly at the end of the line, and he will then be going into Buckingham Palace. No sign of Camilla. I don't know, we haven't seen whether she's following along a few paces behind him. I suspect possibly, well, we don't know.
I think this is I get the impression that this is a very much a solo.
Yeah, it's his moment, isn't it? It's his moment. The King. There we are.
There he is.
He's
Up at the gates.
heading
He
in. Yes.
has greeted an awful lot of people there, and now he can
Wondering
take
where to
in
go.
the flowers. Look at all those flowers.
There's Clive Alderton, his principal private secretary. A guiding word in his ear about where to go. But yeah, I would imagine that he would now just have a little bit of a look at some of the cards and some of the tributes that have been left. Yes.
And there is
Yeah.
Queen Camilla. It must be very overwhelming for him, even though he knew that this was coming. He has been expecting it for very many years, but
Yes, and pretty overwhelming for her as well. This is a role which she had perhaps never fully imagined. She knew what she was getting into, obviously, when she married the Prince of Wales back in, 2005. But she hasn't spent her entire life in royal service. She's adjusted to it over the past 15 or so years, and she has now a number of issues and campaigns which she has made her own, violence against women and reading and all that sort of thing. But it will be a considerable increase in her profile and in what is expected of her as Queen Consort. She will be crowned alongside him when the coronation does eventually take place. She has no constitutional role, but there, Camilla with Charles the King about to enter Buckingham Palace.
so many flowers, so many messages. They don't clearly have time to read them all at the moment, but overwhelmingly, from what our correspondents on the ground have told us, people who've read them, are very much messages of thanks to the Queen. Thanks for her reign, for her duty, for the continuity that she has brought this nation for so many decades.
Yes, and I see that there is, I think, a band of one of the Foot Guard regiments drawn up in the forecourt there. Now, whether they're going to sound a royal salute as he enters, or play the national anthem, well, we shall discover in a moment. But the band is clearly there for a reason. He doesn't seem to know quite which entrance to go in through.
This is all very uncharted
He'll,
territory for him.
He'll get used to that. Yes, wrong door. It's not that often, of course, that they walk along the pavement outside Buckingham Palace, because they normally just whiz in and out in their vehicles.
Very rare to see them walking outside Buckingham Palace.
Yeah, even on Trooping the Colour Day, he, of course, would be on horseback. So, quite a rare moment for the King to walk through the main gates of Buckingham Palace.
And there they go, the King and Queen, arriving at Buckingham Palace, a building, a place, a palace that he knows so well, but in a very different role.
Yes, and he will need to, in time, establish his office there, move his office up from Clarence House, and in due course one must assume that he will take over the private quarters that have been occupied by the Queen, the Sovereign's quarters. I suspect won't see whether he will go in via the King's entrance, which has always been called, but no, if he was doing that he would be turning to the right, which I don't think he's doing. So presumably going in the state entrance. And as you were saying, Sophie, for a busy afternoon, seeing the Prime Minister, they will have a number of things to discuss, and finalising those details, giving his final approval to the details that officials will have been working on, both at Clarence House and Buckingham Palace. Those details for the mourning, for the lying in state, for the state funeral, which we would expect to learn within the next few days. And then his address. Yes.
So armfuls of flowers being carried there by aides, by palace staff. Huge crowds still outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. And the new King and Queen are there. The Royal Standard flying above the palace. The Royal Standard, the only flag that does not fly at half-mast. That is never lowered to half-mast.
Absolutely, yeah, because there is never not a monarch. As we know, at the moment of the death of one, the next immediately, imperceptibly, invisibly takes over. And that happened at Balmoral at 4:30 yesterday afternoon in the room where the Queen's life finally ended, and where, we understand, Charles was at his mother's bedside. So at that moment he became king, and I should imagine that Camilla perhaps would have been the first person to address him as Your Majesty. He's no longer Your Royal Highness, he is now Your Majesty, as indeed is she, as Queen Consort.